Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Merle Wilberding, and I'm one of the trustees of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation. I want to welcome all of you to this evening. This Saturday night author's reception has always been a wonderful opportunity to hear in a more casual way their comments and talk about writing. We especially appreciate the University of Dayton to let us use this facility. It's a wonderful building, a wonderful room, and we appreciate very much their courtesy and curiosity and giving us the opportunity to do this. I want to thank, first I want to recognize the trustees of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize Foundation, Sharon Rabb, founder, Stan. And Tom Lasley, I saw him earlier. Tom, thank you, Tom. And Doris Ponitz, there's Doris, yeah. Good for you, Doris. And finally, Mark Meister, the co-chair of the Dayton. And I want to especially thank Ellen Belcher, who did all the work to make this evening possible. She did detail after detail, work after work. And Ellen, thank you very much. Where are you? There you are, back there. We have some special guests tonight, and I talked with her earlier, and I think I've got it. She's the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it's Anu Trish Babic. Thank you for coming and welcome to Dayton. It's wonderful that you're here. We also have judge, jury, and everything else, judge, jury, and moderary. Christopher Surf. Chris, where's Chris? There he is. Chris, as many of you know, he's a writer, he's an author, he's a TV producer. He worked on Sesame Street, produces Sesame Street, but I personally like Lomax, the Hound of Music. I think that's a great one. So. And also here is former judge, also Catherine Vaz, a professional writer at Harvard. And when I introduced Catherine several years ago, I made a big deal of saying I was really happy with her book, Our Lady of the Artichokes, because it reminded me of, the church I went to in college. It was something like that. But now I found one of your other books, the Book of Faldo, and the reason I like that, of course, is Susan and I were in Lisbon, Portugal this spring, and we went to several of the Fado nightclubs and really enjoyed them. Exactly. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. For our 2012 winners that we have on stage tonight, we have the fiction winner for The Sojourn, Andrew Krivak. And we have, Anya Zuzadlo, the writer of Day of Honey, the nonfiction award winner. And our Richard C. Holbrook winner for Distinguished Service tonight is, and first I'll tell you, Tim O'Brien and I have several connections. We both have a Vietnam connection. He served in Vietnam. I actually only litigated Vietnam. But we were both involved in different ways about the My Lai massacre in Lieutenant Cali. When you read his books, In the Lake of the Woods, and the things they carried, and the books permeated that, and the Lake of the Woods is portions of the transcript in there. And I spent a year of my life litigating Lieutenant Cali when I was in the Army during the Vietnam War. So I've had a chance to drive Tim around today, and we've had a chance to talk, and he tells me he's got more questions, so we're going to continue to talk on it. But it's a wonderful connection. And the other thing is, he and I have both fished in the same lake in Iowa, Spirit Lake, Iowa. So we're delighted to have you here, Tim. And the way we're going to do this, and those of you who've been here before, we'll have a nice panel discussion on it, and it's going to be led by our emeritus professor from Antioch, the editor of the Antioch Review, Bob Fogarty. Bob, thank you very much for doing it. Okay.
Well, I'll just make some kind of general announcements. And the first is that I'd like to thank Ellen Belcher, as has been done. And secondly, I'd like to thank Merle Wilberding in particular. Some of you will know, but most of you won't know, that this week he was honored by the Ohio State Bar Foundation. And he was given one of two major awards by that foundation. He's one of 6 attorneys who have won both of the awards. One is a service award, and the other is a, I presume, scholarly award. In the local Dayton area, Merle is a member of the advisory board of the University of Dayton School of Law and the advisory board of Wright State University College of Liberal Arts. He serves on the Montgomery County Board of Library Resources and the Dayton Sister Cities Committee. He is an active member of Culture Works and is a founding trustee of the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Previously, he'd been on the boards of the Muse Machine, the Dayton Opera, and the 2000 Celebration of Flight and the Greater Dayton Foreign Trade Zone. In his off time, he's an expert in real estate litigation and can be seen prowling, I presume, in supermarkets and other places at appropriate times. I wanted to mention it because all of the members of the committee are volunteers. This is a completely volunteer organization, and many of them are in the audience, and I hope you'll meet some of them. So it's a totally volunteer organization. I'd like to also thank Christopher Cerf, who's been already introduced, but some of our other judges who I hope you will meet in a future year. Ken McLean, who is a rather distinguished professor at Cornell University, a very good essayist. April Smith, who writes literary thrillers of a very high order. The characters actually change in April's books. They're not the same at the beginning and at the end, and so that's what makes them literary. That's actually the justification for it. And Alan Chews, who, of course, many of you know is the commentator for NPR. One of the things that should be said this evening is that all of the judges got along famously. They did not disagree. They came to common conclusions, and as a result, that's not always been the case. On a couple of occasions, we've had to send in what I will call a literary SWAT team. To sort of sort out the difficulties between one individual and another, and a number of us sort of have had to do that. It hasn't happened too often. Fortunately, our guests have been already introduced, and we will have some mystery guests later on this evening, and we'll do that at a later point. I think what I'd like to do is, I've already alerted the panelists that there are no great surprises in the questions, so it's not a trick, it's not a pop quiz that they have to somehow respond to very quickly on the spot. And I'm sure that they could do it without any difficulty. And I should say, just parenthetically, that although she was never a student, Anya went to Antioch College. Which I did not know until her book was picked by other judges. And so it's great to see her here, even though I never saw her on the campus when she was there. She was probably away and never there, actually. So I thought I'd just simply pose a question for all of them, and they can take it in any order they wish. The first question is, what was the most difficult moment or choice you had to make in the course of writing your book? And since Tim O'Brien has written a great number of books, he's had to do this for a long, long time. And his question is similar to that. Were there any difficult choices you had to make in the course of a very long and distinguished career that stand out in your mind? So if anyone wants to respond to that, namely, what were there when you write a book, did you discover you hated a character, or you wondered why you actually chose that topic? And anyone want to start?
Okay, well,
Andrew?
I've just been told to start, so I'll do this. but I'm happy to, actually. So if you've seen my book, you notice it's quite short for a novel. And I think the most difficult point for me was to decide about not just the shape of the narrative, but the arc of the narrative. Let me go back to say that much of that book is shot through, and no pun intended, but maybe, shot through with stories that I heard from my grandmother about various and a vast sort of panorama of relatives from my family who primarily grew up in the old country, what at the time was Austria-Hungary, which is now Slovakia, but under the Hungarian Empire, and in this place where you were conscious of your local ethnic identity, but under the the rule of the Habsburgs. What I needed to do very succinctly is to decide, is this going to be some kind of sprawling epic? Because I imagine that the essential story of my grandfather, who grew up in the mountains, was conscripted as a young Slovak to fight in the Austrian army, fought on the Piave River, was captured, imprisoned in Sardinia, and walked home to Czechoslovakia. That has fascinated me since I heard that story as a boy of 6. And I imagine a kind of nonfiction Cold Mountain. And I realized quite quickly that just wasn't going to work. And thankfully, my agent said, "It sounds to me like you want to write a novel." It's my first novel. And I said, I do. That's what I would like to have it become. So what I did was over the course of years, I sort of took all these characters that I'd heard about and distilled them down into the one single character you have of Joseph Vinich. And everything he goes through, I've heard someone go through. I think that was probably the most difficult period. I think the most difficult way of imagining the book. And then, too, I had to think about the person, the voice. It's written in the first person, except for that early interlude. And I never knew my grandfather. He died before I was born. But I've sort of been haunted by his ghost, and I wanted to try to put that story in the first person. And so as a result, you see that when the first person begins, you're actually in 1972 in Pennsylvania. And the story is a kind of, is a going back. It's a sojourn of memory as well as of physical geography. At which point this man of 73 tells you, the reader, there had been other people around this kitchen table, and they've, draft after draft, disappeared. There were 2 brothers. There was 1 brother. And then there's just you listening. And the story proceeds in the first person. So I think that was the point at which the epic stories, I should say, for lack of a better word, just kept getting pared down more and more and more and more until this book came in, under 200 pages. That's my answer.
What was the question again?
Difficult moments.
What was the most difficult moment you had in the course of your dealing with the manuscript? Were there moments where you decided that it was impossible, that you'd taken the wrong tack, or that you had to throw away half of it, or any number of things?
Were there moments when I didn't think it was impossible? There was a moment when I was like, hey, wow, this was just a bad idea from start to finish. This is a terrible idea, and everything about it was wrong. And that was, I had this very, very stubborn idea that I had to write this book. Very, very briefly, the book is a memoir of the time that my husband and I spent in Baghdad during the war, and then in Beirut, also during war. And so I had it in my head. We had actually moved back to New York City by the time I came up with the idea of writing the book. And I decided that I had to be in Beirut to write this book. I maintain to this day that that was the right decision. But partly it was also this very stubborn kind of, I've got to be there, I've got to be on the ground, I've got to be experiencing it moment to moment. And partly that's the journalist in me. It would have felt dishonest to be writing about things from memory. I think that was my own ambivalence about writing a memoir, because writing a memoir is writing things from memory, right? But the journalist in me was like, no, if I remember something some way. Look, the journalist in you knows how faulty memory is. I don't know if you guys have ever played that game Telephone. Do you know what I'm talking about? Anyone who's ever played that game, being a journalist is like playing that game all the time. And when you interview people about their memories, you really realize that it's incredible. And when you interview yourself about your own memories, you realize how faulty they are. So for this reason, I felt that it was very, very important for me to be on the ground in Lebanon. My husband, who is actually from Lebanon, was not very happy about this. He was extremely unhappy about this decision, and if you guys make it to the end of my book, you'll see some of our conversations, which I actually recorded verbatim. And by the way, people ask us a lot about dialogue. I actually am the kind of person who takes notes, like at the dinner table. So a lot of that stuff is just stuff that I wrote down as it was happening. And he would come back to visit me. He had a job in New York, and I was like, look, I'm going to take off. I'm going to be in Lebanon for like 3-6 months. That turned into a couple of years. We would go back and forth. He would come back to Beirut, and like I said, not very happy about this, my husband. But there was a point in 2008 when the neighborhood that I was renting an apartment in was invaded by a couple of militias, one of which was Hezbollah, but there were other ones in there as well. And we were literally surrounded by gunfire, and there were armed men in the street, and our neighbors were getting shot, and things were extremely, extremely, extremely ugly. If you make it to the end of the book, there were sort of religious tensions that I won't go into because they're really complicated. But basically, my husband was the wrong sect for that neighborhood, so it was very, very dicey for us to be there. I felt that I had brought him into this terrible, dangerous situation, basically out of stubborn, willful, I've got to be there kind of. And that was really one of those horrible moments when I was like, sweetie, I think you were right. Maybe it wasn't such a great idea to be here. And actually, at that point, he couldn't even leave the country because they were checking people's religious ID. They would have known from his last name and from where he was from that he was that religion. The airport was closed. It was a disaster. It was kind of one of those moments when you're like, what's the worst thing that could possibly happen? And it could be your fault because you had to write this book your way. I did that thing. So fortunately, we survived. That was the most difficult moment. That was my, wow, I should never have written this book moment.
I can't think of one single most difficult moment, except a recurring one, which is the making of sentences, how hard it is. And most people think of writers as always involved with big stuff, plot or character or theme or what, including nonfiction. But in any genre, the ship floats or sinks on sentences, and it's the constant attention, sitting in your underwear in front of a computer day after day after day after day, paying attention to what's behind the sentence, the characters one is seeing and the story you're trying to tell. But the frontal lobe up here is on verbs and nouns, and now and then an adjective, mostly, pretty much now and then, in my case. And the grace of language, the ebb and flow of it. You don't repeat a declarative sentence, one after the other, after the other, after the other. Varying patterns of language, which most common readers will only notice if you don't do it. If you don't pay attention to these things, you'll notice, boy, this is boring, and there have been sentence after similar sentence after similar sentence. And that for me is a kind of turning point, because I'd always conceived of writing as paying attention to the big stuff, telling of the story, and not to the hard, gritty, moment by moment, even syllable by syllable work of making a piece of art. It's not just the characters and the themes and so on, it's the sentences in the end. And I think that the recognition of that early on and the difficulties I was in for a lifetime of being a writer, and thinking I'm still going to do this day after day, was a kind of turning point.
Yeah, I'm struck by the fact that there's a famous remark by Hemingway, and Hemingway said the dignity of an iceberg is that only 1/8 of it is above water, so that a writer's life is really the 1/8. And the second is Forrester's remark in that wonderful book of essays, in which he says the essence of writing is summed up in 2 words, and the 2 words are "and then." Which is quite true. What happens? What's going to happen next? And it's a variation on Scheherazade, of course. You got to tell the story, and your life depends on it, or your death depends upon it. The second question, which is, I think I asked it last year, and were there any things that surprised you about the reaction to the books that you've done? I mean, I'll give you an example. I once published a book, and it had an index in it, which was appropriate, and there was a review that queried whether or not, why was there an index in the book? And the reviewer said, wanted more pictures, and the index sort of got in the way. And I was sort of flabbergasted by it. I couldn't understand who this person was, and why would they say such a silly thing. And that's kind of on the mundane level. But on any other level, things that surprised you about your reception of the book?
Well, I can think of one right away. This has happened several times. I've thought of my work as anti-war. And I've gone to colleges and signed books, and somebody will come through that line and say, man, now I really want to go, having read that book. And it's not just surprising, it's like, it's in a sense, like the Vonnegut line, it's like fighting a glacier, you know. That's the feel, in a way, that how a book can be so misread or so misunderstood, or maybe it's my own failure with these sentences I've been slaving on. Somehow made it glorious, or I don't know what has happened.
Maybe if your sentences weren't as good.
That could be it. And it takes some, lessons, and I know just the writers to ask.
Any reactions? Or you were just happy to be published? I mean,
So what Tim said just reminded me of something. I think people see what they want to see in your books. Like, we don't own them. Once you put it out there, it's yours. And there's this funny thing that people always say to me. I have this very explicit part of the book where I say, bread and salt brings people together, we break bread, but actually that's really only half the story, because then people in civil wars break bread together and kill each other the next day. But it's funny because people always come up to me and they say, oh, your book is so wonderful. It showed me that, we can all break bread together and we can all be friends and we can all get along. And I was like, wow, I'm so glad that you found that message in it, because I feel like the entire book is about people not getting along at all. But I love that that's what people take from me.
Yeah.
I mean, from my perspective, my novel was turned down by 34 publishers, right. And so, so for me it was a question of do I keep at this, or do I put it in the drawer and work on the next one? And I keep going. I'm sorry to keep going back to my agent, but she's sort of also my kind of my spiritual director too. So, and she said it's your decision. She exhausted her Rolodex, and ultimately came down to no one thought they could sell it. Why would anyone buy a book about a boy who's born in America, goes to Europe, fights for the Austrians, and is a Slovak, and it's sprinkled throughout with language that isn't translated. Why would anyone want to buy that? And so she said, but look, if you think it should be published, then you have to go try the independent presses on your own. And I did, and I was lucky to have Bellevue, Erica Goldman at Bellevue Press, pick it up. Just simply because she said, and I quote, I love it. That's what she said. And it was 2 days later that Tinkers won the Pulitzer Prize, and I called her back and I said, "Are you sure you want this book?" And she said, "Oh yeah, let's do it." So that was a happy circumstance. So then the reception subsequently was probably my big surprise. But what it taught me was, I think, something similar to what certainly to what Tim's been talking about, is that nothing matters to me except what gets me back to the desk in the morning. I don't read any reviews because it would either make me too happy or it would infuriate me, but it wouldn't get me back to writing a good sentence. It's not gonna get me out of bed and say, okay, what's the next one? And the next one's different, and you have to think about the ways in which the same stuff you bring to the desk is there. How is it retold? Is there something new? Is there some new way of looking at it? I'm assuming that each book is, well, I'm not assuming that each book is new, and so that was the reception that surprised me. But I have to say, it's helped me. It's helped me really realize that what matters is that I get to do this thing that I love, and only those things that help me sit down and write are going to be those things that I pay attention to. So.
But I still hope that all those 34 publishers, I hope when you won this prize that you emailed it to them.
No, they don't care. They really don't care. It's funny. It's
true, they
it's just it's profit and loss. It's bottom line, and they have a job to do. They'll lose their jobs if their books don't sell. And so it's kind of like,
They don't know what makes a book sell, though.
That's
thing.
exactly.
They'd be the first to admit that.
There's no algorithm. There's no sort of this will work and this won't. So
I should say that for those of you who don't know, it's published by the Bellevue Press, and it's associated with Bellevue Hospital that underwrote a journal and then eventually a collection of books. And I was thinking, if the Miami Valley Hospital is looking for a local literary magazine to throw some money in our direction, I'm perfectly open to meet with them on any turf and any ground at any time. I feel like I should be a member of Congress, actually, as a result of that. Sharon, do you want to? Sure. This is our surprise. It's not Sharon, it's the surprise. It's that she's going to give a surprise.
Hi, and I have to personally thank the people in this room because I know you know that it's because of your generosity that we're able to bring these people here. And what a wonderful evening they're giving us tonight and another one again tomorrow. So give yourself a big pat on the back for being such a forward-thinking person as to do such a thing. One of the things that many of you know, maybe not all of you know, is that we do have what's called an author series that was started by John and Stacy McDonald. And in the author series, we every year invite one of our former winners back into the fold of Dayton, and then we meet them, talk with them at a fundraiser. They go out to the Rotary, or they go out to Books & Co., or they go to Miami Valley School, or they go to another school. And so every year we bring people back. And we like to think of these wonderful people as part of our family. And two people from our family are here this evening. They're going to be presenting awards tomorrow night. And I know that many of you have spoken with and know these two people. And so I will make their introductions brief. But I would like to welcome to the stage our nonfiction winner from 2011, the wonderful Wilbert Rudeau, who wrote In the Place of Justice. Wilbert, if you want to come up. Thank you. And those of you who have not met Wilbert before may find it most interesting to know that Wilbert spent 44 years in Angola prison. While he was there, he started the Anglite. He has won many, many awards in film and in writing. He continues to work with public defenders around the country, working with incarcerated people. He is a most amazing man who has come to us tonight from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Our other guest, our other surprise guest, is our 2010 fiction winner, who hails from Kingston, Jamaica, and now more recently from Minneapolis and St. Paul, Marlon James. Marlon's book in the Book of Night Women is a most amazing account of slavery in Jamaica. And if you have not read In the Place of Justice or the Book of Night Women, those will be on sale tomorrow night, okay? And they will also be on sale tomorrow at Books & Co. should you want to come and meet these wonderful men again. Marlon teaches at McAllister College, and I'm hoping that, and I'm sure Bob is going to do this, we'll be talking about what they're up to now, and since they have won the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. Thank you very much.
When we originally thought about this, there were various names that we thought we'd give to these individuals. Since the prize has been going on for long enough now, for 7 years, so I thought, well, they were like emeritus faculty, except that makes you old immediately, and that's not so good. So that you're basically alumni of the awards in that sense. And I'd like to ask both of you, one, how many publishers have turned down your most recent book? In light of what's been said, but has anything happened which we ought to know about with regard to what you've been doing and if the award made any difference in any significant way?
Okay, the first question was how many publishers turned down the book?
It's a common factor. I turn down hundreds of essays and stories every day, actually.
Well, I was lucky. Everybody wanted my book. And there were, I think, about 12 or 14 publishers, and, you know, it was one of those kind of things because it didn't make it a bestseller. So, you know, I have to work for a living now. But, and the next question was...
Well, do you have anything that happened as a result of winning the Dayton Literary Peace Prize?
Well,
do people come up and, you know, shake your hand?
I took you 10 grand and I bought a house. I mean, seriously. I mean, you know, I was explaining it to a couple of friends earlier that, you know, a lot of people look at awards as, well, you know, it's a feel-good thing, and it's status, and it's a little honor and all that. But, you know, there's another level, a real nitty-gritty level. If you know, it can make a difference. And I was in Myrtles Beach, South Carolina, when the word came down about, you know, it was in the New York Times, about $10,000. And I was talking to my wife on the phone, and she had, you know, been checking out the houses and whatnot, and she told me about this house that was on the market, and I said, go for it. When I got home that Monday, you know, we already had a bid in on it, and it was the $10,000 that was the deciding factor. So, you know, you did good. Thank you. And the punchline is that since then, we spent a week in Denver, and now she wants to sell the house and go stay in Denver.
Marlon?
Am I answering the rejection question?
You can skip over it.
Yeah. Well, my first song, it was, I mean, it's a pretty common narrative. I mean, it was rejected by quite a few publishers, enough that I actually destroyed the manuscript. And it's because I just figured if so many people hated it, there must be something wrong with it. And totally destroyed it until an independent publisher as well, actually, Akashic Books, really fell for it. And the editor asked for a copy, and I didn't have one. And I said, well, actually, there is none. And some friends of mine who were in a workshop, they were like, he's lying. He wrote a book. He just doesn't want to sell it to you. I was like, no, it really doesn't exist anymore. And I found it, thank God for IMAX. I found it on a first generation iMac lost somewhere in an email outbox that's sent to somebody. And I didn't have enough paper to print it. So I just basically, you know what, let's just chop the first 20 and the last 20 pages.
Right.
And nobody has ever said, this book feels a little incomplete. So let that be a lesson, creative writers. Your book probably is starting too early and ending too late.
Yes.
And then Akashic published it. Post Dayton, it's funny. I was telling when I was here earlier, a couple months ago, I was talking about the interesting ways in which this sort of Dayton network came about. Maza Mengi is my big New York drinking buddy. Right. Chimamanda Adichie is trying to get me married. And the audience didn't believe, so I played her text when she asked me, are you open to race? And Dave and I were coming up with an anthology of contemporary Caribbean fiction. And nonfiction and poetry. So, I mean, there's been a pretty big sort of afterlife, and I think the writers involved do get sort of connected and really sort of, interact and help each other. Richard, Bush is just the sweetest guy. Right. And I love reading his Facebook posts because men are usually very crazy. And his are very inspirational, so between the two. So yeah, it's been this sort of great sort of afterlife Dayton-wise. In terms of, what was the last question? I can't remember, was it the third question? Was there a third question?
No, there wasn't.
Oh, good.
No, there wasn't. No. Are there any questions from the audience? We have a mic, so anyone want to ask any one of the panelists a question? Please.
A true war story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story you feel uplifted, or you feel that a small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue. As a first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by its absolute and uncompromising allegiance to obscenity and evil. So my question is, how do we get to the power of the written word to promote peace by telling each other war stories?
Anyone?
Now you've intimidated me. It goes hand in hand. There wouldn't be a need for a peace prize if you didn't have war, or the prospect of war. This book that I just read, and I'm sure you're going to end up reading it, and your reaction is going to be the same thing. This To End All Wars, the one that won the award for this year. I was telling Susan earlier that, that after reading it, I can't, when I think back, the last book that shocked me and horrified me as much, that gave me that kind of emotional reaction, was when I read Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and that was so long ago. And here comes this book, and I read it and I was just, wow, I can't believe this. You know, that's supposed to be the reaction. Otherwise, there's no need for a Peace Prize. You're supposed to be appalled at what you read. And that's the kind of books, that's what a good book does.
Anyone else?
I mean, I'll take a shot at it. That it seems we're, as a culture and maybe as a world, we're surrounded by pressures to sanitize war, to dress it up, glorify. Think of the Veterans Day parades and the 4th of July and what you see on television. And that is, that stuff contains elements of truth. There is self-sacrifice for men who go off to battle. There are acts of great valor and courage, but it's not the whole story. The whole story includes evil, a day-by-day nastiness that's not, you don't witness on television, you don't get in movies, and you very rarely get in books. And hour by hour, it's like being dipped in crankcase oil. Sin after sin after sin, usually of kind of modest proportions. By modest, I mean kicking around a teenager, or peeing in a well, or shooting a chicken that belongs to some old farmer, or a little less modest, burning down a house. And we can go up the scale to full-scale atrocities. The role of art, whether it's poetry, fiction, or nonfiction, screenwriting, is to press back against this hardened carapace of insulating us from the realities of what war is. No matter how righteous the cause, it's still sinful and evil, and it contains acts of sin and evil on a daily basis. This isn't to say there aren't times when we don't have to fight back against fascism and bullyism, but there are a lot of times when we're making wars when perhaps we ought not to be doing that. We pay our diplomats for a lot of money. I mean, let them earn it, you know? Mr. Holbrook sure as hell did, didn't he? And for me to get a thing with an award at the end of my career, with the word peace in it. I've been called a war writer my whole career. And I think of myself as a peace writer. And I've always thought of myself as a peace writer. And I'm sure that my colleagues up here are all in agreement about that, yeah, we display the ugliness and the brutality, the obscenities of war, as a way of contrast against that alternative, that shy, unbragging word peace. We're at peace in this room, but we didn't think that. You didn't walk into this room, and I didn't. But we are. But if this were a war happening around us, you'd know you're in a war. It would be right in your face, and you wouldn't doubt it for a second. And so you fight back. It's like this, as you said, it's fighting against that contrary thing, and sometimes you fight back through displaying those unknown uglinesses. I mean, that's the best I can do.
Pretty good. Go ahead, please.
I'd like to say something too, because so I've never been in a war. I've lived my entire life in peace. And in my very first reading of this book, well, let me back up and say, but I mentioned the fact that I'd been haunted by the ghost of my grandfather, who, against all odds, somehow survived a war that millions didn't survive. So I took it as a personal challenge to research that and to get as much into that world, both on the ground geographically as well as even just this. You know, I pored over World War I memoirs to listen to what these men were turning back or giving back later on literarily. But Two things. Once, my very first reading, a man in the first row at Porter Square Books in Cambridge asked me the question. He said, "Were you ever in the military?" And I thought to myself, oh, here it comes. He's going to rip me apart. And I said, no, I wasn't. I've never been in the military. And he said, well, I want to know how you got it right. And I said, I didn't get it right. What I was this. I spent 8 years in religious formation as a Jesuit, and that was the only thing I had to fall back on. And I thought to myself, this is a book about a coming of age of a man I didn't know. I know about coming of age, and I know about a discipline and a training that isn't necessarily martial, but in a sense is there to form, in this case, to form a man. And so I can't write a book about a man in war, but I can write about a man who's being formed particularly morally, which I think ultimately becomes a sort of moral ambiguity, but attempting to be formed morally and still living the life. And ultimately, so that's what I said to him, and he said, well, he didn't say anything. And afterwards he came up to me and he said that he had been in Vietnam, and he just thought I did a fine job with it, and to me that was enough. And I dedicated the book to my mother, Irene, not only because she had told me all these stories, because it was she who impressed upon me the fact that her father had somehow survived, and for the rest of his life after that, raised her to be a woman who strove to be peaceful in her interactions with people as opposed to contrary. And Irene in the ancient Greek, the Greek of the church fathers, means peace. So in some ways I felt like I would just make it a book for peace.
Yes, I think also that the title of Andrew's book is The Sojourn. And as some of you know, there is a magazine called The Sojourner, which is dedicated to peace. But at the same time, it's a wonderful metaphor for undertaking a journey. It's a tremendous, in the book, one of the major characters in the book constantly reads from a bunch of books, and one of them is Moby Dick, which is a sojourn. One of them is Walden, which is a sojourn both inwardly and outwardly, and there's violence in it if you read it very carefully. It's not just a kumbaya story. I'm trying to think of the other titles, but they're all books which deal with journeys, and to undertake a journey is to understand oneself and also at the same time to understand others. And it seems to me that that's what all of these authors do on a constant basis, and they don't receive sufficient recognition for undertaking a difficult literary task. At the same time, they're engaging in a fairly solitary activity, which is, as in the case of Hawthorne, when he left Brook Farm, very famously, he was living in a community, and the first thing he did when he moved to Emerson's house was to turn his writing table to the wall. He'd had enough of community and had to get back to the writing. And the writing was really what was important. The subjects change and they vary. Sorry to go on. Other questions, please?
My question is simply just having had the privilege of reading most of these books, I was thinking about the comment about violence war. Do you feel that violence is just part of the texture of the human being's soul? You know, like I read Tim's book and I read End All Wars, I read Marlon's book, and the violence is part of the lifestyle of these people, the way they see the world. Is that just part of the texture that we have to live with? And that's is there an inevitability of that gets translated maybe in slavery, treating people unfairly in prison, you know, ethnic wars around religious definitions that people have to have a PhD to understand, et cetera, et cetera.
I'm going to jump right in on that one. I can't answer your fundamental question, like, are we inherently violent or not? The territorial imperative, this is a big debate, right? Scientists, behavioral scientists, but one thing that you do witness when you live in a city that is that's sort of falling into civil war, you witness violence being taught. Violence is taught very methodically to people during civil wars. You see people who would not be violent if it were not taught to them. Would that have happened some other way? I don't know. But it is a really, really horrifying thing to see people being inculcated with violence. And I can tell you people that I know of, people specifically, who would not have become violent or said violent things or done violent things if it had not been taught to them very, like I said, very methodically. And so I tend to lean toward no. I tend to lean toward no. I don't think that, human beings, human animals as we are, really necessarily maybe not have to be as violent as we are. But again, the sort of deep fundamental question, like, I don't know.
War may well be inevitable and may be at the lot of the human race, but so is death, for example. We're all going to die, and it doesn't mean you give up on life with the knowledge that you're going to end up in a grave or in some cemetery. On a case, it's a breath by breath enterprise in the pursuit of peace. It isn't peace in general or in the abstract or even forever. It's case by case, and one asks the legitimate questions: is this cause worth dying for? Is it worth killing for? What can be gained from it? Do we fully understand the reasons behind it? It's the hard political and philosophical work of examining circumstances we live in. And it seems to me that too often the countries, including our own, are a bit quick on the draw, looking for the military solutions before the weapons of mass destruction have been verified, for example, just to make a point. There weren't any. And if my dad had, in World War II, aboard a destroyer in the South Pacific at Okinawa or Iwo Jima, had learned that Pearl Harbor hadn't happened, he'd have been pissed. Wouldn't you? The reason to go to the war doesn't exist. And that's what I mean by case. So let's say we somehow can resolve this problem. Sure, along the line, I'm sure inevitably we'll face other such circumstances. But I don't think it means we give up on the daily grinding work of doing what we can to find sensible, peaceful solutions, the same way one would with your children. Stop them from fighting as much as you can. It doesn't mean you're not going to fight, tomorrow or the next day or a year later. So in general, I'm kind of with you on your comment. I think probably you may be right, that something in human nature, I feel it in my own soul and psyche, a bit of, I get angry. And it may be, I don't know for sure, but I think it may be, part of what it means to be human, is to have aggression and so on. At the same time, we don't stop fighting against it. And I think each of us in our own ways up here have done what we can through art to press back against it, just to push back. And that may be the best we can do, but it's sure something.
Having lived in a peculiar environment, which was populated by people who've done the worst things you can imagine to each other, and people who were violent, and the prison happened at that time to be the bloodiest in the United States. You had to go to a war to encounter a higher level of individual violence. I don't think war is inevitable, but I do think that violence, like crime, and it's the same thing, I think it's part of the human fabric. I think that we are all, and we're talking about war. War is, that's at a political and a societal, organized level, but it all goes back to individuals, because every society is a collection of individuals. It's all individuals, and every individual is born with the dual potential to do good and to do bad or evil, to be violent and to not be violent. And we all have the ability to be violent. Everybody can be violent. but then animals can be violent too. And the glory of the individual and a people is to learn to solve your problems and achieve your objectives without that. And, but I, you know, I believe everybody, you know, a lot of people feel that, oh, I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that, but I've seen good people do very horrible things, and I've seen very bad people do some very good things. I mean, that's just the human fabric. I mean, we're a bundle of contradictions, but, you know, I don't know.
Any other
Make
questions?
hope, somebody.
No. Any other questions from the audience? Well, we settled that. Oh, yes, please.
Mr. Krivak, I wanted to, as a reader, I wanted to compliment you on the relationship between the father and son that you depict in the first third of the novel. I thought it was very complex and fresh.
Thank you.
And lovely. And the question I had as I was reading it, as a teacher, I often think about how to pair novels together. And there are so many iconic anti-war novels that come out of the First World War, obviously. And I was wondering if that book list, what impact did it have on you to have all those books that you would have to sort of be in the company with? I'm thinking of All Quiet on the Western Front, or Separate Peace, or some of the poetry that came out of Great Britain. It would have paralyzed me. How did you deal with that?
Well, first of all, I'll say I wasn't trying to write a war novel, a First World War war novel, but at the same time, of the period, I was trying to understand the, what's the word I'm thinking of here? There's a kind of, it's the tone, it's the voice. I've read all the poetry. I read. There's a great many other books that come from the Southern Front, from Italians. Giuseppe Ungaretti's poetry is beautiful. I've been doggedly trying to study my Italian so I could read Ungaretti, but it was mostly for me, again as a writer, that I would read those books and distill those books almost like it was, again, research on the ground, where some one word would have to be the right word that I knew I would ultimately need to use, and it would be informed by those texts. So, A Farewell to Arms, I had been to Gorizia on the Isonzo River. The Isonzo was a beautiful cottony blue river. And Hemingway says in chapter 2 of A Farewell to Arms, there were many victories that spring for the Italians. And so, of course, when Vinich is telling the story, he has to say that there are many defeats that spring. It's the other side. That's a very sort of superficial response, but I made great friends with Paul Cornish at the Imperial War Museum in London. I was living in London at the time while I did this research. He let me hold a Mannlicher 95 and told me that they used beeswax on their boots in the mountains, in the Alps. And the Fort Sherrill in the book I had been to with my 18-month-old in a backpack up in there in the Austrian Alps, and to see those old-style big bunkers where they would lob artillery shells 1,000 meters across valleys, and haul with mules, haul big guns up mountains that you need a mountain guide to go up to, and they had them. So, in any case, my answer though is, I realized that that's only 1/3 of the book, the war. But in a sense, too, it informs the sense of it. And what I wanted to do was to get that right as a writer while I was still telling the story of this young man coming of age in what he often called the old country.
Any other? Well, I'd like to thank the panel for their comments, and thank you all for coming.